velkomin á þennan Súpufund. Mjög ánægilegt fyrir okkur hérna dag sérstaklega að fá fólk í húsið á námskeið. Það er búið að vera skrýtnir mánuðir náttúrulega eins og við öllum. Og verður ykkur góður. Chris Barnes hérna hjá okkur. Hann kom hérna fyrir 2 árum og var með námskeið hvernig við getum nýtt data í hérna. Við erum að skipuleggja æfingar og leiki hjá félagum okkar og hann núna með námskeið fyrir UEFA Pro-hópinn sem með námskeið í gær og svo aftur á morgun. Og okkur fannst tilvalið fyrst að væri komið til landsins og við loksins komum með erlendan fyrirlesara til landsins að nýta hann og hafa meiri til í það. Þannig að nú ætlum við að tala hvernig þetta nýtist í yngri flokkunum líka. Chris?
I'm just going to get a water. Yep.
And feel free to ask as many questions as you can. And Chris will remember to repeat them for the sound.
You'll remember to remind me, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Anna Bill. I'm English, so I haven't got a clue what Anna Bill has just said about me. So excuse me if I replicate anything that's just been said there. I'm a sports scientist. I have worked in football now for the past 25 years in England and in various places. I've had the role of fitness coach. There's so many different roles that I'm sure you folks are aware of. It's all a bit crazy. I've been a fitness coach, I've been an S&C coach, I've been a performance manager, a sports scientist, and I don't really know what the difference is between them. I work with players and I work with coaches to try and get players fit, fundamentally. For the past 10 years, I've worked for myself as a consultant, which has been great because I've got to visit places like Iceland and do quite a lot of talks. And something that has become really apparent to me is how important it is to, not just in terms of these talks, but in terms of what we do with players and coaches, to try and ensure that any messages that we're giving are as simple as possible. And that's not because it's no disrespect to players, it's no disrespect to coaches, it's not because they're not intelligent. Most of them are super intelligent people. But sometimes the conversation that we want to have with them is new to them, and it's different. So the calibration point in terms of where we start the conversation is so important. Just a little bit of background. I'll just make sure this is going to work. There we go. Okay, that's a good start. So, a little bit of, it's not the zapper, the presentation. That's frozen. Okay, this didn't happen yesterday. You're going to have to excuse me 1 second while I just restart the presentation. I don't think there's a problem. I think it's just playing up. Duplicate, I think. You want to duplicate? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so over this time, I've worked with a number of clubs in the UK, predominantly with the senior professional end of the sport. And I know that most of you, if not all of you, are working with the youth end of the game in Iceland. I started out with Middlesbrough in 1996, and for 12 years managed their performance department, which included the academy at the time. So I did have staff on the ground who were fitness coaches, sports scientists, nutrition, and things like that. And it's only since leaving Middlesbrough in 2009 and working with a whole host of other clubs in England, and obviously there's Brøndby there, who I currently do a bit of work with in Denmark, that I've come to actually realize that different places in the world are in totally different positions in relation to how they approach the management of the players they work with. And that's become even more apparent to me over the past 6 months when I've started a bit of work with a club in Nigeria who really are at the start of their journey in every sense of the word. They've got coaches with no qualifications. They've got zero in terms of resources and facilities, but they have invested a little bit in some technologies, and they're asking me to try and help them on a little bit of a journey. And I'll come back to them at a couple of points during this presentation. I've also done a little bit of work with basketball, with rugby league, and in the NFL with New York Giants. And the reason I mention that is what I'm going to talk about a lot today is a set of principles. And it's principles that I use in my work with coaches and with players. It doesn't matter whether I'm working with senior players, with youths, with female players, with male players, or in other sports. The same principles actually travel. And so hopefully what we can do is arrive at a situation where you can see exactly what I'm talking about and hopefully just reflect and take it back to your own place of work, and maybe some of them you can take and apply in the management of your own players. I've also, as of late, I met Arne and Bill in some of the work that I do with UEFA, but I do similar work in Africa with CAF, which again is a confederation that is at the start of a journey by comparison to UEFA. So it's just, again, just pitching in and trying to ensure that the work we do is at the appropriate level. So this is the important thing then. Every one of you works in different environments. I'm going to talk predominantly about general principles. It's you that will be able to apply the context of what I'm going to talk about today to your own work. Some of it will apply, some of it might not apply, some of it may totally miss the mark, but hopefully each of you will take something from today that you think, okay, yeah, there's something in what he's saying there. I'll be obviously a little bit disappointed if we don't find something of value for everybody. I'm going to talk based on the standard, what you might call an implementation cycle in football. And it's a process that everybody goes through to differing extents at different component parts. Obviously, we all plan for what we hope to deliver with the people that we're working with. We'll execute a session. A lot of my time has been spent monitoring, reporting, and then most importantly, actually bridging the gap between any information we create and what we do next. So managing what happens. And one of the mistakes I see in a lot of places where they start to engage in the process of monitoring their players at whatever level, and I'm going to talk about different levels today, is they focus on the technology that they use, or they focus on the instrument they use to collect information, and they focus on creating shiny reports and spreadsheets and lots of nice information as a result. But they don't focus enough on what we actually do with this in order to impact positively on the players we work with. So for example, something that was mentioned to me earlier about a challenge you've got with some of the players that you work with in Iceland is they're training with different clubs or different organizations, or even with the same organization, on a whole series of evenings or a series of days per week. They're engaging in a huge amount of activity, possibly for their age and stage of development. And unless somebody has their eyes across that whole process, it's really difficult to actually manage that individual to ensure that in a year or 2 years' time, their progression has been optimal and they've reached their potential. That's about 50% of the coaches that I've worked with in English football. Some of them you might recognise. I'm sure a number of them, a lot of you won't recognise because you're too young. But in their own way, they're all fantastic coaches, all terrifically experienced. Sometimes, so in the case of, for example, here, Steve Clark, we started a number of years ago, one season with him. He got the sack. Alan Irving came into the club that we were working with, and we ended up, actually, at the end of the season, working with this guy, Tony Pulis. They're all different. They've all got the same job, but they're all different in the way that they work and the way that they approach their work. My job as a sports scientist or a fitness coach very often is about providing them with information that will help them to make decisions. And the challenge is, every time a coach changes, I've got to reorientate myself with the way that they work. Because if I'm providing them with good information, but it's not calibrated to their philosophy, then it's a waste of time. So the first thing is, as a fitness coach, I've got to think like a football coach, and I've got to totally understand what the coach is trying to achieve. Quite often, in a lot of places and a lot of clubs, I'll see, for example, the strength and conditioning coach will sit in the gym and they'll live in the gym and they won't actually go onto the field and they won't understand what it is that the coach is truly trying to achieve with the players that they're working with in order that they can actually go back and retro-engineer to the kind of work they're doing with the players to prepare them for what they're going to face. I'll give you an example why. So there's two coaches here that I work with in different clubs. So I mentioned Tony on the right, who, if anybody follows English football, Tony is a little bit of a legend in his own way. And he's a legend in the fact that he's so out of date and old-fashioned and proud of it in the way that he works. But he's very fixed in his philosophies about how he wants the game played. Whereas Jimmy is a relatively new and young coach on the left, really keen and eager to work, but again, quite fixed in his own philosophies. And the way that they see the game being played really differs. And you might find this with coaches. You know, imagine the case that you've got a player who is working with two different coaches and they have totally different philosophies in how they want to train and how they want to play. How then are you going to actually manage that player effectively for their own development? So this example here, specifically about when the team loses the ball high up the field. What is the coach looking for the team to do? In the case of Jimmy, he's very cavalier and brave. He wants the whole of the team to immediately press. So forwards lead and everybody else pack in behind them and try and win the ball back early. Whereas with Tony, you lose the ball high up the field, forget it. Everybody retreats back into shape and a very compact shape in the center of the park, so the opposition can't play through us. If anything, they have to play round us. Now, the physical implications of those two styles are totally different. And if I don't truly understand the differences between the physical implications, then really is the work that I'm going to do to try and physically prepare the players going to be appropriate? You certainly can't use or shouldn't be using exactly the same approach that you've used, let's say, with Jimmy. If Tony then came into the club, professionally, we should be looking to reevaluate just what we do with players in order that we give them the best chance of performing. Something that has become really, really at the forefront of the work that UEFA do, and it's something that you might want to consider if you don't already yourselves, is how and where you do the fitness work with the players that you work with. Okay, with the very young players, maybe the 11s, 12s, you probably don't do fitness work. They play football. They're not quite ready for it. But for the players as they get slightly older, obviously if you're taking on board on-field fitness work, one of the things that UEFA are asking us to consider is actually how much fitness work can we do within the context of the football that we play. So in what they're referring to as an integrated way, rather than, it could be at the start of a session or the end of a session, bolting on some running or some form of isolated physical work because we feel that that's appropriate. And actually, what we're seeing is it's quite easy with well-designed football drills to tick most of the boxes when it comes to fitness work. So integrated fitness work, what we're saying is we actually start with a game with what we're calling reality-based situations. The beauty of that is we can actually develop a number of physical qualities within the same space rather than isolating, okay, we'll do, personally, I've got a real issue with box-to-box running. I don't know why it has a place or where it has a place in football. I don't know where you'd see people running at what is half pace up and down the field for 80 yards in a competitive game of football. But then I'm not saying that there's no place for isolated work. And one of the places possibly for isolated work is when you're dealing with young players who might be going through red flag phases, where they're going through phases of growth and development or peak height velocity, whatever you want to call it, where you want to manage the exposure within the chaotic environment of football, but at the same time, you want these people to try and continue developing physically, and the safest way to do that is in the controlled environment of isolated physical work. So there's pluses and minuses, pros and cons to both an integrated approach and an isolated approach. First thing is, integrated work is efficient, time efficient. And if your mode of managing your players is purely on the basis of how much time they're on the feet or on the grass, you can tick boxes efficiently with integrated work. Of course, you're doing it within the context of football. So they can see exactly how that is applying to them in their own game. It's football specific. It's a difficult one because fitness coaches have egos. And part of that ego is lived out in the time that they have the players under their control in an isolated way. I was one of those fitness coaches for a long time. I felt as if I was almost doing myself out of a job if I was handing the players over 100% to coaches to effectively deliver the fitness work. But actually, it's a partnership. And as long as the fitness coaches can speak football and they can work with the football coaches to speak fitness, it's a collaborative and a collective approach. And the beauty of it is the players love it. The players would much prefer to do their fitness work within the context of football than isolated running. On the downside, some environments the coaches don't want to integrate. They don't want to work collaboratively. They want the fitness coaches to actually do the isolated running. And that's something I certainly have come across on a number of occasions. And to take this approach effectively does take time in the first place. You've got to give some serious thought to exactly how you're going to deliver. And then because it's football, and football is possibly one of the most random and chaotic sports in the world, it's a lot more difficult to actually control who does what and when. So from the point of view of the isolated work, clearly, if you're dealing with players in isolation of the ball, it's easier to individualize and it's easier to control exactly what players do. And then relationships are so important within any sporting environment, and football's no different. The beauty of taking the players out and certainly working with them one-on-one, it does actually give you the opportunity to build that trusting and respectful relationship that's so important in the environment that we work. And then the downsides of isolated work are pretty obvious from what we've said previously. It doesn't possess a huge amount of game context. Even the movement patterns, I go back to my box-to-box running. The movement patterns, the way in which muscles are recruited in box-to-box running don't reflect anything you see in the game of football. And then very often, so for example, typical approach on a Premier League away game would be we would play the game, 14 or 15 of the players might play the game. They'll come in at the end of the game. Those that haven't played or those that have played 15 or 20 minutes, the coach will say, okay, Barnsley, take them out for a bit of work. The groundsmen don't let you play football after the game, so you've got to run them linearly. And these players feel like they're being punished for not being selected. It really isn't a pleasant experience for anybody involved in that. So the isolated approach sometimes has so many negatives attached to it. A couple of terms that you will probably use pretty much daily in the work that you do will be fitness and physical performance. And a lot of us will actually use these terms almost interchangeably, thinking we're talking about the same thing. They're actually two subtly different concepts. So if we're talking about fitness, what we're actually talking about is that which the player possesses in terms of their capacity to do some form of work. The problem we have with football is, whether it's training or matches, it's not maximal. So to play a game of football or to go into a football training session, we'll draw from the different fitness components to differing degrees, depending upon what we're doing, but we won't drain them. It's a little bit like the fitness being your food cupboard at home, your ingredients cupboard. You need to bake a cake, so you'll take the ingredients that you need out, leaving the others in the cupboard, bake your cake, and then you'll go shopping and replace those that you've used. So you've drawn down from the fitness to perform your physical performance in training or in games, and then you'll restock or recover and recoup your fitness. So if we do any testing, like yo-yo testing or speed testing or things, we're testing the capacity, we're testing fitness. But a lot of what people do nowadays during training and during games is they're actually monitoring the physical performance. So there's a differentiator between fitness and physical performance, and also between testing and monitoring. The difference between the two at the end of a session we can call performance reserve. And generally speaking, fitter players at the end of a session will have a greater performance reserve because they haven't drawn down as heavily on what they have available. So just keeping with, and hopefully the concepts I'm talking about, the principles are relatively simplistic. Another word that I think, again, we all probably use in the context of what we do in training with our players is load. And load is another thing that means so many different things to different people. To me, it's simple. There's two sides to the load equation. There's what you do with all of your players every time they go out on the training field. So you ask them to do a piece of work, and they'll accomplish that piece of work, with or without the ball, whatever it is you're doing. You're applying some external load to the player. But as soon as they start moving, the body knows you're moving. The body immediately tries to perform functions to return itself back to its comfort zone, which is rest. So in order to do that, heart rate increases, ventilation increases, respiration increases, metabolism within muscles increases, and there's all sorts of internal responses taking place. Now, we can't measure all of those things, but some clubs may have heart rate monitors, which are a good means of measuring the player response. And I'm going to go through another mechanism which doesn't demand that you have any money whatsoever or any resources to actually look at your players' internal responses. So two sides to the load equation, stimulus and response. There's the external load, what they do, and you'll report that and record that, but you'll record it in your session plans and your session notes. You're obviously not using GPS technologies, the modern technologies, I know that, but you don't need them. We need to adjust and calibrate what we do to suit what we've got available to us in terms of resources. So something that you're probably all familiar with is this that's been around for years and particularly used in relation to the young players that we work with. And the FA coined it the four-corner model. And the idea that if we're going to work with the whole player, we don't just address the technical side of the game and maybe the physical side of the game, but the psychological and social sides of the game and the person have equal importance. And what we know is when we're actually working with players, we're taking them out of their comfort zone or their equilibrium, not just in terms of technical questions we're asking or the physical side, but in all four areas. And what we're looking to do, hopefully, is to provide a prescription that doesn't take them so far out of this comfort zone that they can't return or recover back to this state of equilibrium, the state of comfort and balance, if you like. So, keeping everything as simple as possible, I've been really fortunate in that I've had access to some quite sophisticated monitoring technologies. And the principles that I use with those sophisticated monitoring technologies are exactly the same as those that you can use with other approaches that are less cost intensive. And the first thing is, I've got to think about exactly, okay, if we're going to start to measure and monitor what we're doing with our players, what exactly do we want to know? And fundamentally, the two things we want to know is how much work they've done. And a simple measure of how much work they've done to start with could be how long they've trained for. And secondly, how hard is the work that they've done? How hard is the session that they've performed? Now, the volume of work that you do potentially is a real enemy of the coach. So I'll go back to this club in Nigeria that I'm working with. And if their coaches had their way, the players would be training for 2.5, 2.75 hours a day. Now, my view on that is why? Because if you can't accomplish what you hope to achieve in 1.25 hours, then I'm questioning the planning that's taking place in terms of what they do. But that's the way they train, or the way they have trained in Nigeria. And players are turning up to matches absolutely fatigued because there isn't sufficient time for that recovery and restoration. And the other thing is, because they're training for 2.5, 2.75 hours, the training isn't conducted with any intensity or tempo. And so they're not actually stimulating the body's functions in a way that prepares them for football. So the volume intensity equation really should be managed in such a way that we have fit players, of course, but also that we have players that are fresh. And then if we can measure these two factors, the way that's easiest to report it to players and to coaches is to think of something that they can relate to. And what they relate to is a game. So, okay, let's report it relative to what they'd expect normally to happen within a game of football. And then the final bit in relation to these principles is, and this really is derived from the work that I do with these GPS technologies, and even if you haven't had access to them, I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that these technologies create a huge amount of information. It's information overload, almost. And if we're not careful, if we try to communicate this sort of information to people that have got no experience of it, we'll turn them off before we've even begun a journey. So a simplistic way of thinking of it, for me, and this is with senior professional players who love cars, is to use an analogy of a car and to put all of the information that we're interested in into one of three boxes. So the first box of information is the engine of the player or the car. And that could be information that we collect subjectively on this internal response to what we've done with them. Second one is the stresses and strains that we're putting on the chassis of the car. So that's the musculoskeletal system. And in these GPS systems, there are what you call inertial sensors, accelerometers and gyroscopes, which are really clever little bits of technology, and they actually give us the capacity to measure these stresses and strains there. And then the ones that, even if you've not used the technology, you're probably familiar with, are what we'll call the locomotive parameters, and that's what you see on the dashboard of your car. So how far you've gone and how fast you've gone. You've heard people talking about high-speed running and sprinting just total distance covered, top speeds, things like that. These are all our locomotive components. Now, collectively, these, if we've got access to technology, will give us a whole picture. But there's an awful lot of us work in environments where we don't have access to it all. But that shouldn't actually hinder us wanting to collect some information on the effectiveness of what we're doing. So we'll just look at how we might go about planning. This is from last week or the week before. This is the skeleton of information that I would send through to the people I'm working with in Nigeria. And what this is my attempt to get them just to start to think, first of all, think about a whole week. So what are we going to be doing with our players this week? But also, I don't want them to see me as somebody who is totally focused on the physical side of things in isolation, but to look at things from both a tactical and a technical perspective. Because if they had their way, they'd play 11 versus 11 football every day. And they'd think that that's okay, it might be preparing the players for the game, but it certainly isn't developing them as rounded footballers. And so we've got a program detailing the days relative to the next game that they play. We'll tell them when we want the players to go in the gym. There's a very, very broad overview here of some of the work that should take place, but then there's gaps in each of these. And what we give them then is a number between 1 and 5 that indicates the level of importance of that particular component on that day. So for this particular week here, this is what we gave them. And this is, for me, is a great starting point for the planning of any week. So let's start the day before the game, where the most important aspect of that is obviously looking at the game. This scores a 4. The technical side of things only scores a 2. We're not working on the technical aspects of the game for players. And the reason the physical side scores a 3 is in terms of priming players for a game. Generally speaking, most clubs will use a drill that will be a 7v7 or an 8v8 small-sided game that they're really looking to be played at high tempo. Now, the real preparation day for match day is here on match day -2, where we're saying focus on 11v11 team strategy. An 80-minute max, not 180 minutes, but actually just trying to guide them as to where their focus can and should lie. From the physical side, we're asking them to get that work in earlier in the week so that they can taper a little bit towards the weekend. There's no hard and fast prescriptions here, but hopefully on a daily basis, we're giving them a point of reference and they're actually planning, forward planning, if you like. Going back to the terminology, it's what we try to get the coaches in clubs that we're working with, and at the moment, I guess in this journey in Nigeria, is getting them thinking about drills in terms of the different stresses that they're going to place on the players. And this is something that so many professional coaches, highly qualified coaches that I've worked with, sometimes fall into a trap where they deliver vanilla training. Every day consists of drills which essentially are the same. And there was a picture there of a guy called Aitor Karanka. So Aitor's a lovely guy. He's a Jose Mourinho disciple. He worked with him as his assistant in Real Madrid. And he worked with good players in Real Madrid. I worked with Aitor at Nottingham Forest, where the players are not Real Madrid players. They're tier 2 English players. But Aitor tried to deliver Mourinho drills in that environment. So every day we worked in small areas which are technically challenging and mentally challenging because players are having to deal with the ball quickly, make good decisions, and it's very mechanically challenging. Remember the 3 categories of load? It's hard on the legs and on the skeletal system. So Monday to Friday, we were working heavily mechanical. Now, to optimally prepare players, you need to think about giving them a varied diet. With some mechanical work, which is providing this technical and cognitive overload, but also some drills or some days which are focused on more locomotive work, which is bigger areas. So the players get their head up more, and they're seeing different pictures, and they're making different decisions. So the illustration is just simple, 5 versus 5. But okay, if we're working 5 versus 5 in a 15 by 15 or a 20 by 20, and then we increase it to a 30 by 30, it's a totally different drill, cognitively, technically, and physically. If we start from the point, just to give you an illustration of the impact of changing conditions, start with the point of a 6 versus 6 possession drill here. So we'll call this the reference drill. And all it is just a 6 versus 6, try to stop the opposition winning the ball back. Like I said there, if we increase the area, it has the impact of, it won't affect the mechanical stresses, they're still high. But the locomotive stresses, the running stresses will increase. There's more space, so people cover more area, more distance. The second, we make this directional. So previously, there's no sense of direction. We're not playing towards a target. We're playing in a space. As soon as we make it directional, people will play a position. And that cuts down the space they play in. So it will, against the reference, it will reduce the locomotive load because they don't go into the same spaces. But it also reduces the mechanical load. If we take our 12 players and change things slightly, so, okay, let's say the reds are against the blues and the yellows, sorry, the reds and blues are playing and the yellows are chasing the ball. So it's 8 versus 4. When the yellows win the ball, if it's the blues that make the mistake, they're chasing. So it's a continuous drill with the overload. Generally speaking, what we'll see now is overall the locomotive demands don't particularly change, but it does increase the mechanical demands in this environment because of the additional work and stress during that period of time they're chasing. Take 4 players out and make them wall players, and we increase demands both ways. And then obviously take players away, again you can increase demands both ways. So obviously the same drill, manipulated and modified, but used appropriately during the week or during a cycle of 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to totally impact on both locomotive and mechanical stresses. And what we want, as I say, is this healthy diet. I'm just going to very quickly go through the process that we use. This is at Queen's Park Rangers with Jimmy. And when I went in with Jimmy, so I knew him anyway. I'd worked with him as a player at Middlesbrough. We went in at Queen's Park Rangers, and the big challenge was players were absolutely shattered going into games because they'd done a lot of work during the week. That was Jimmy's coaching philosophy, was to work the players hard, high volume, high intensity. So what we did was we created this model, which is similar to the one we saw with the Nigerian club, where each day in the week had a technical focus, a physical focus, and we were monitoring using tracking technologies. So we had the luxury of information specifically related to volume and intensity. Now, because we were trying to do high volumes of work during the week, I, first of all, tried to protect the players going into the game on the Saturday. When we went in, the rest day was on a Wednesday, and then they'd work hard again Thursday, and even on a Friday, quite hard. So we pushed this forward in order to protect the game, but also to provide the opportunity for the coach to do what he was wanting, which is to work the players hard. There was a technical focus each day. And so these are the key sessions here, Tuesday and then Wednesday morning. And we'd change the focus from a technical perspective. And we'd rotate this. So 1 week in possession or attacking on a Tuesday, defending on a Wednesday, and then we'd rotate the following week. Hopefully, by the time we got to Friday, we ticked all the boxes we need to, when we could have a short, sharp, focused session built around match preparation. There'd be a physical focus, and these terms here we introduced before. So mechanical was small areas. This week, locomotive with large areas the following week. And we'd rotate, whether it was attacking mechanically or attacking locomotively. This session on the Wednesday afternoon, the players would go back out, well wrapped up, and literally just walk through scenarios in relation to the game. It was really light. We would, a lot of coaches are not very good at sticking to time schedules if they don't have somebody helping them to manage it. So if a session is going well, they want it to continue running because they're enjoying it. If a session is not going well, they want it to keep running because they want it to improve and get better. So you've got no win. But one of the things that we did negotiate with Jimmy was maximum duration for sessions. And we had his assistant working with us to give Jimmy the nudge to terminate a session when we wanted. And then we set targets based on the information that we had in relation to volume. So between 70 and 90% of a game, almost a game's worth, possibly. Intensity between 65 and 90% of a game. So you create a system where you've got green, amber, and red sessions. Green one's relatively light, amber moderate, and the red is high. Obviously the game, because this is the reference, is 100% volume and intensity. So we've got that point of reference. So when Jimmy says on a Wednesday morning, okay, what was the session today? I'll just give him squad data. I say, okay, it was a 70-90. That's fine, it's within what we were targeting. So I'm not trying to give him a detailed report or detailed information about individual players unless there's something awry here, and then we can start to dig into the information that we have. So coach wants the players to work hard. Players are working hard, but by Wednesday lunchtime, they're in recovery mode. Because Wednesday afternoon is light, Thursday's a rest day, Friday will be short and sharp. Okay, so how does that apply to people that don't have GPS technologies? Well, we'll look at an approach that we used, again with Queen's Park Rangers, but to plan over a longer time frame. I've got my numbers in there for volume and intensity, but it doesn't have to be based on those numbers. We can purely think about it as easy sessions, moderate sessions, and heavy sessions. From a volume side of things, that could just be the duration of a session. Easy session, less than 60 minutes. Moderate session, 60 to 75. Hard session, anything over 75 minutes. So everybody's got access to a watch. So we've got easy, moderate, and hard there. How does that look? Well, this is a week's training for Queen's Park Rangers. It's a championship club, tier 2. Typically, we'll have 2 games in a week. And then we've got these volume and intensity measures down the bottom here. So this is how we planned it. We planned it according to the colour coding, not according to target volumes and intensities, but we do know that what we're looking at on the day before the game is low volume, a short session, at moderate intensity. Remember the Nigerian thing where we said, okay, the physical focus is actually a 3 out of 5 on this day, but for a very short space of time. We can apply a scoring system here. So if we add up the colours, 1 plus 3 plus 1 plus 1 plus 3 gives us 9 for the volume for that week. Similarly for the intensity, 2 plus 3 plus 2 plus 2 plus 3 gives us 12. All right, so using the same approach, we know what games we're playing in the next 6 weeks. So why can't we just take this simple colour coding approach to think, okay, we've got opportunities here to give players a taper week or a light week. We can manage them using this. And at the moment, all I'm using is a pen and paper. That's the only technology I'm using, maybe a watch to time the sessions. But what we've got now is a situation where we've got targets being created on a week-to-week basis. Now, what we can do without any technology is, okay, if we plan to do a 60-minute session and for some reason it runs over to a 90-minute session, it's gone from a green to a red. What we obviously had the luxury of was the capacity to collect the real data. But you can use a watch and you can use player perceptions in terms of, okay, was it easy? What did you think? Was it easy? Was it moderate or was it a hard session? You know, you can get subjective feedback from the players just to give you what you need in terms of what happened against what you've actually planned. I'm going back to Middlesbrough days now. When we first got hold of the GPS system there, we all went a bit giddy and we measured anything that moved on any occasion. And one of the things that one of my interns did was they looked pretty closely at the youth game. And certainly one thing that we found, which was pretty frightening, was between the ages of 13 and 16, when we started to measure what these players were doing in games, and we compared it to the senior game, they did less. But when we adjusted for their own capability, so we did it, remember this, fitness is your capacity, performance is what you do, their capacity is much lower. So you measure it relative to what they're capable of, and all of a sudden we're finding out that the intensity of the game of the 13 to 16-year-olds was way, way more than it was in the senior game. Now, we can't control the intensity that they play at. So all the more reason why we need to get a handle on the volume of work that we're doing with younger players. So control the controllables in that instance. In terms of monitoring, okay, why would you monitor? It's pretty obvious, and if we were to do a survey of everybody here, you'd probably come out with these reasons why you would. Okay, if we monitor players, it gives us a closer handle on what they do. So we can manage the way that they train, performance maintenance, or at times, how can we actually improve or enhance performance? If we start to closely monitor them, we will make the right decisions. We'll make much more good decisions. So hopefully, part of that will lead to reduced risk of injury. And fundamentally, with young players, it helps us to actually map and monitor their own development in a controlled way as they progress through the game and through the age groups. But you know, even using those color codes, if you're using an approach like that to monitor players and you're seeing, okay, we'd agreed with the coach, we'd do this and we did that, that gives something to have a conversation with the coach and say, look, come on, you know, last 2 days, we agreed we'd do this and we did that. Exactly the conversation I had to have with a Nigerian coach yesterday, who for the 2 days previously had trained the players, and they had performed something like 3 times the amount of accelerations and decelerations they would perform in a game on both days, successive days. Their overall training demands were something like 1.3 times what they'd do in a game. So they played 2.5 games in 2 training days. Now, I'm not suggesting you're dealing with things like that here. It'd be much more subtle, the kind of questions you'd be asking. But monitoring will actually give you the basis to have conversations with the people that you might want to or need to have those conversations with. The coach is king, absolutely. And if the coach has an opinion, you know, the coaches I've worked with, if they've got an opinion on fitness and all I've got is an opinion of my own, his opinion or her opinion will count for a lot more. So having this information actually helps me to go in and level the playing field and challenge the subjectivity that many coaches will work with in areas that they're not experts. And then I talked about us trying to quantify what happens in the youth game. That's a performance question that we were able to address. So I'm talking about monitoring then, and really in football, it exists on 3 levels. So the first one is this subjective monitoring, which could be a conversation with a player. Secondly, if you've got an amount of resource, potentially you can measure internal load using heart rate objectively. And then with a lot of money, you might have GPS technologies that will enable you to map internal and external load using tracking devices. But what I'm going to focus on here is the use of RPE, which, if you're not familiar with RPE, it's rating of perceived exertion, something that's been around for years and years and years. And it's a simple questionnaire like this. So at the end of a drill or the end of a session, you ask a player, how hard was that? And if it's the hardest thing you've ever done, it's a 10. If If it's very easy, then it could be a 1 or a 2. And you get a number from that player in terms of what you've done with them. So the cost is a pen and a piece of paper and a few photocopies of something to record the information. Okay, so first of all, these numbers are really useful because what they can enable us to do is to create something for every training session called session RPE. Quite simply, we multiply how long the session is in minutes by the score. So if we get a 6 off a player and it's a 60-minute session, then your session RPE is 360. In this instance, to create this match reference, remember we want 100% match reference, 90 minutes, and this player's given us a 7. So our comparison point here then is 630. Right, so let's just look at a training session then that we've performed. And this is real training data, by the way, for 12 players. Warm-up, passing drill, possession drill, crossing and finishing, and we finished with a game. A classic Tuesday or Wednesday session with a smaller squad. We've put the areas in there because we've seen already the conditions of the drill will impact on what we result in. We've got the planned duration. It's a 70-minute session. Now, it's important we record the actual duration because in this instance here, for example, the session's 5 minutes longer. This is 2 minutes longer. But after each drill, we've taken an RPE of our players. And this is the average of the 12 players for each of these component parts. So we've got a session RPE now for each of the drills, 30, 24, 84. And we've got a total for the whole of the session. And we've only used a pen and paper. All right? So if our two important numbers then are volume and intensity, and we know what a match looks like, and players won't give you a 10 after a match, because a match isn't maximal. Football match is not a maximal event. So we've using the one that we had, which is a 7. You probably have different. So there's the reference. Here's the session. It's 50%, 57% of a match. So we've got a measure of the volume. We did 57% of a game today. And actually, intensity isn't that much more complex because we take the volume measure and we account for the fact that our session isn't the same duration as a match. It's a 77-minute one. So the intensity of this session was 66%. So now we're moving a little bit away from, that looked like a tough session. What did you think, coach? To something which is a bit more objective and something that we can use as the basis for ongoing monitoring. In terms of, we okay? Yeah. In terms of managing our players then, something that we're all involved with now, whether we're fitness coach, S&C coach, physiotherapist, technical coach, manager, whatever we do, we're all involved in the business of trying to effectively manage our players. And here's the challenge that I imagine some of you have with players that are maybe training fairly long sessions, 5 days a week, possibly playing a game on the 6th day, is what you're trying to do is to manage this load. Now, the load is the work that they do. And if we're constantly withdrawing without sufficient recovery, we will eventually put our players in a situation, a kind of a red flag situation. It's like managing your bank balance. If you keep drawing from your bank balance without putting sufficient money back in, you're going to end up in financial difficulty. And it's exactly the same situation. Fundamentally, load management is about withdrawals and allowing this opportunity to recover. It's in the news in the UK all the time at the moment. The media are all across it. Daniel Sturridge was injured training with England because the performance manager said there is no evidence for matchday +2 recovery. He played for Liverpool on the Saturday, reported on the Sunday for England. Performance manager said there's no evidence, get him out there and train. He trained, poor Roy Hodgson, and he broke down and he was out for nearly 18 months. That's poor load management because they didn't follow the advice that was given from his club. Bielsa's all over the news at the moment. This is great. Leeds have their own, in every sense of the word, they have their own way of working and their own style of playing. Questions were asked in the first season. Is he mad? Because a lot of players get injured. But Leeds' approach is about survival of the fittest. And he can do that. He does it. And it's effective. You've seen the results that he's getting now. He has a squad of players who are acclimatized to and capable of working in his conditions. And then similarly, Steve Clarke with Scotland had a lot of grief, very similar to the Sturridge thing, where a player got injured on international duty. They all relate to load management. They all actually also relate to what we call a transition period, where a player goes from one environment to another, or is exposed to a different environment. And any transition is a red flag. So, what do I mean by transition? Well, we could be referring to when the players have had a few weeks off and they come back into pre-season. And for years in England, the toughest 2 weeks of the season are the first 2 weeks of pre-season. So you reward the players for a heavy season by giving them a few weeks off, and then you punish them for having a few weeks off by running them into the ground. And then a week or two later, they break down, and you wonder why, and you're looking around for people to blame. It's crazy. So off-season to pre-season should be carefully managed. Players returning from injury, there should be a proactive plan. The problem is when one of those players is one of your golden boys or girls, and the coach is so delighted to see them, they do the training session, and then they keep them out for a bit extra. And the coach's assistant keeps them out for a bit extra because he wants to show how good a coach he is as well. And this player, all of a sudden, is doing way too much work. So return from training, or return to training, return from injury is key. What we've got to be mindful of, in both of these situations here, the players haven't been training with the others. So your technical expectation of them as they return to training should be calibrated. Their motor skill capacity is reduced. Don't judge them on day one. Similarly, they haven't been exposed to these training environments for a while. So the decision-making efficiency will not actually be as finely honed as it would be after a couple of weeks adaptation. And they will fatigue quicker, and they'll be less efficient in the way they work from a physical perspective. So 3 of the 4 corners there are affected in these situations. Other periods of transition. When a player joins a new club, or, we saw there, when a player goes on international duty, different coach. When a new coach arrives at a club. Or when young players move up squads and play with different squads of players who may be better than the ones that they've previously played with. All of these are red flag situations and scenarios. And we've got to be mindful that there are challenges in each of these 4 corners for these players. So we've got to be patient and not be judgmental with them in terms of our expectations. On a physical level, all of these situations and the ones previously, if we're talking about returning from injury or returning to pre-season, it's a 7 to 10 day adaptation process. It'll take that long physically for the players to adapt. To be honest with you, I couldn't tell you in terms of decision making or the technical side of things, but it doesn't happen in 1 session or 2 sessions. It will take a number of sessions. We've got to be careful, we've got to be patient, and we've got to program time in order that we can make appropriate judgments on players there. To assist them with this, it's good that we do understand exactly what they're going through. Obviously, any of these transitions changes their routine. It changes their reactions to the situation, but other people's reactions to them as well. It could be that, certainly if they're going into a different club, for example, their role has changed within the team, within the squad, within the organisation. And the relationships will most definitely alter over this period of time when they move into a different situation. And all of these are factors which add to stress. And they will spend so many times, you will see players returning from injury they spend so much of their time reflecting on what they can't do or what they haven't done, rather than what they potentially can do. And we've got to deal with the emotional side equally as much as we should be dealing with the physical side as well. So, obvious follow-ons from that, what can we do? We should certainly, in periods of transition, phase the exposure. So when players train up, it could be that in the first session when they train up, they have a particularly good session. And okay, that's enough. We'll keep them with that squad now. They've proved themselves. I guarantee in most scenarios, when players do play up, of course they'll perform, but they don't possess the capacity to perform in a sustained way. Play them up, train them up for a week, return them to their squad, and then bring them back another week later and give them this dosing effect of the new stimulus. It's at times like this, and particularly you're talking about young players here, and those that might, if they're aged 13 to 16, if they're male players, 12 to 15, female players, it's a time when the basics are just so important. Simple things, sleep, nutrition, and programming recovery. It was difficult when you're training 5 times a week or more. And so going back to the initial message, just don't overcomplicate with coaches. Don't overcomplicate with players at these times. It just adds to the cake. It just adds to the stress that they're in. So just to close then, I'm sorry I've gone a few minutes over. I'm a huge fan of simplicity, and hopefully the principles I've talked about today are relatively simple, and I've given some ideas for the application. I know I've spoken about environments where clubs and people have access to quite sophisticated technologies. That was to illustrate the principles, but I've hopefully provided some examples where you don't need access to huge amounts of resources in order to be more objective in the way that you work. And the second thing is, and I guess I'm referring as much to my current experiences with this Nigerian club, we're on a journey. We're on a journey that's complicated by Nigerian politics. The game over there is corrupt. I'll give you an example. Nobody films games in Nigeria. Nobody films games because referees are corrupt and they don't need that evidence. This team that I'm working with, when they go to away games, they take 8 cameramen and they film the game professionally. Twice this season, all of their camera cables have been cut by the opposition and no decisions are made. So the journey we're on in Nigeria, we're trying to actually introduce new ways of working, coaching, monitoring, etc. But we're also trying to change things in a much, much bigger way. So it's going to be a journey that's a little bit of a longer one. But it's not a good example for the way things are in Iceland, of course, but nevertheless, in an Icelandic football, you're on a journey yourselves as practitioners and with the players that you're with, and it doesn't happen overnight. Hopefully, there's one thing from what I've said today that will help you folks in your day-to-day practice. I know I'm over time. Are there any questions anybody has? Anything that I've proposed there? And if you do ask a question, remind me to reiterate the question. Anybody got a question? Yeah.
Recovery is for all age groups, you think?
So the question is recovery for all age groups? Appropriate recovery is for all age groups. I don't know if you monitor growth and development, so you can pinpoint with those players that are growing the period of time when they're going through this growth spurt or period of peak height velocity. Recovery is even more important for those players than it would be for those before that age. So let's say, for the sake of argument, we've got a player who's 14 years of old and they've been identified as going through a growth spurt. Prior to that, recovery is important, but it won't be such an impactful factor as when they're going through this phase then. You have to cut back on the volume of work these players do when they go through growth spurts. This is the purely and simply overexposure while players are growing, what leads to things like Osgood Slatter's issues and the like. So, super important, yeah.
Do we get the slides afterwards?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I will send them to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We also obviously recorded the session, so you will also get access to the video.
Yeah, and my email address is on there. So if anybody has a question and you don't want to ask it in the group, but you want to email me, I'm more than happy to address. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just interested on your thoughts on Leeds. Obviously, they're very...
On Leeds?
Yeah, not...
Dirty
not
Leeds?
But just the way they train, obviously, to be able to start with. Are we too cautious on some of our younger athletes in trying to protect them too much, whereas we're not breaking through that, reaching their full potential, and trying to push them to not just maintain their physical performance in the first team, but achieve above and beyond it. So can we increase the stress at a younger level where they're not going to break?
At Leeds, there's only the senior squad that play murder ball. Are you familiar with murder ball? Yeah, you know the way that they organise it?
Yeah, they just kick the ball in and they run back to the spot. They don't throw into corners.
They kind of do. So what I haven't got a pitch, but what they have is, obviously they've got an 11v11 on a football pitch. They have staff all around the pitch with footballs. There's a member of coaching staff in each quarter of the pitch, and they spend 4 bouts of 5 minutes, 20 minutes screaming at the players. It's madness to watch, and the tempo and physical intensity is crazy. And at the same time as screaming at them to work physically, they're also screaming at them if technically their work isn't huge. It's Wednesday, it's match day -3 every week. Do we protect young players? They do protect young players because Bielsa isn't daft. I mean, he clearly is one of the most highly respected coaches in the world, and he has a huge interest in what goes on with the under 19s, under 17s, and they certainly don't engage in those kind of activities. Their focus is an awful lot more on the technical and physical development in a much more controlled way. Do we overprotect young players? So,
from what I mean by that is like the match day +4, +2, +1, whereas their kids, should we just let them play as much as they can throughout their development, just to expose, like nothing under 19s, obviously then you look after them a bit more, but like 16s all the way down to the young stage groups, just because they're here to play and they just want to play. Are we structuring it too much? That's just not it.
I think we structure, by you saying we, if I say we in the English sense, when we first introduced what they call the EPPP, Elite Player Performance Plan, which was introduced by the Premier League in England, and it provided really, really rigid structures for how academy football should be played. And that was definitely too controlling and too rigid. They will be on the field. So under 17s, we're on the field for 17 hours grass time per week. Can we do some of that time in the gym? Or can we do some of that time elsewhere? No. It's 17 hours grass time, and the EPPP police came in to audit it, everything that you did, and it was also strictly controlled, irrespective of the outcomes and the outputs of that. It's now been relaxed so that clubs can actually work according to their own philosophies. You've got to forgive me that I don't know, I'm looking at Arne Bill here, the situation in Iceland, whether it's left to the clubs to a large extent, or whether it's
Totally left to the clubs, how we train.
Yeah. The other thing you've got to obviously understand, well, I'm sure you do understand, is and I've learned this with senior players, so with young players it's even more so. You can have two players, 24-year-old centre halves. They're both 6'4". They've both played 240 games. So they're playing the same position. They look exactly the same. You can give them a prescription of a training session, and you'll see two totally different responses. So they do the same amount of work, external stress. Their internal responses could be totally different. They're playing a team sport, but they are very much individuals. And if we're guilty of anything, we're guilty of treating them as one and the same. So this is my session for the squad today. We have to know our players as individuals. I spoke yesterday. The centre halves is a great example. And it happens with young players as well. So in England, we're so old-fashioned in so many ways, in so many clubs. We start pre-season with lots of linear running. Linear running is a recipe for disaster for lanky centre halves. We have seen Achilles soleus injuries in so many of these guys, predominantly the older ones, I have to say, but also the younger ones that are going through that growth spurt. Because we know that bone grows before soft tissue. So the soft tissue starts off a little bit stretched. And then we put them through these repetitive running exercises that just niggle away and nag away at those tissues, and eventually they break. It's the weakest link. We've got to understand and know our players. And certainly in those important age groups, if you're not measuring height of your players and you're not trying to identify when they go through a growth spurt, that's a great starting point for some form of effective monitoring if you're working with those age groups. I don't know if you must have done stuff on peak height velocity with the youth coaches, have you?
Yeah, we do a little bit on the B lessons and more on the youth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important. It's important.
Are there any more questions? Okay, then Chris, many thanks. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you.